There we go. We are perfectly on. Well, also, I'm very, very excited to have all of you here today. I think before we really kickstart into the future of energy transition, maybe we can start by hearing just a little bit more about each of your funds' focus. We have a lot of startups here today. Perhaps you can kickstart Daniel from the Atlantic Labs. What are typically the key criteria? What type of climate tech startups are you right now looking to invest in?
Sure, totally. Everyone, super nice to be here today. So I'm with Atlantic Labs. We're a pre-seed fund based out of Berlin, Germany, but I'm privately based here. So, I'm sort of Mr. Nordics for us. We invest as early as it gets, sometimes in founders alone, sometimes in companies that have already been established and are running at the pre-seed stage, typically acting as the lead investor in those rounds. And climate and energy has been a big push for us for the last 3 years. I guess we'll talk a bit more about what type of topics we've invested in, but it's a theme we look at broadly, both from a software and hardware standpoint, and we don't shy away from some of the bigger and bulkier bets also. So happy to get into the details in a bit.
Perfect. Maybe we can continue, Rene. I mean, you founded SET Ventures since 2007, so you must have seen a lot of different startups from industry.
You can tell by my gray hair that I've been around a little bit in this business. When we started in 2007, this was called clean tech. That word we never use anymore. It's now climate tech, which really talks to the fact that from SET Ventures, we have focused from the beginning actually on what we call the energy system transition. So we focus on all those companies that have an impact on decarbonizing our energy system, but use digital technologies to make that happen. So that's what we focused on. We are closing our fourth fund in a couple of weeks at 200 million and are keen to invest all through Europe. And our focus is Series A investments.
Perfect.
I'm Adam. I work for a fund in London called Albion VC. We've actually been around for about 30 years and have grown to about 1 billion under management, focused on seed and Series A B2B software investing. So we're actually sector agnostic, but I've personally been at Albion for almost 11 years now, and I'm solely focused on climate tech. And that's along with the rest of the portfolio. So looking at the role that B2B software has to play is an enabler and an accelerator to net zero. When I joined Albion, I actually started on the non-kind of tech side, helped raise and deploy about 150 million into renewable energy infrastructure investments, so small-scale renewable energy generators across the UK. So with that background, having transitioned over more to the software space, although I say I look at all areas of climate tech, the energy transition is an obvious kind of focus for me and for us.
Perfect. Maybe you can actually continue a bit on that, Adam. You mentioned that you've been seeing a lot of different renewable energy tech innovations in the last few years. Is there any key learnings that you would say, especially if we look on the future energy transition, that you could mention about?
I think it's an interesting having both backgrounds, because obviously the amount of renewable energy generation needs to increase massively. So there's a big infrastructure requirement. But then transitioning that over to the world of software, there's a big role for software to play in the efficiency and the optimization of everything along that value chain of the energy transition, from the infrastructure build and helping to scale it up quicker, helping things to connect to the grid quicker, helping with the whole planning process, through the kind of grid expansion that's needed, the grid management that's needed, the concepts of storage, battery optimization, co-location, right through to the end markets and kind of enabling access for customers to renewable energy generators. So there's a role for both hardware innovation and software innovation across the energy transition value chain.
I think because you mentioned also that your key focus is more on the B2B side, but specifically on the software technologies. And I think it was very interesting when we earlier, Rene, were discussing, and perhaps you can open a little bit more on that you also as a fund, you focus more on the business model side instead of just putting perhaps these specific, so to say, walls between software and hardware. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more of what you mean with that.
Yeah, that's a question we always get. Do you invest in software or in hardware? I think that distinction is not the right one to apply to the energy sector. I think the division actually should make in, do you invest in digital technologies or in analog technologies, where analog is, molecules, building wind farms and things like that, asset management. That is what's more of an analog business. The digital side is, quite frankly, every product these days has software in it. A product without software does not exist. But the question is, how do you package that software solution in a business model? Is that as a sole software solution in a SaaS model, for instance, and solely sell the software? Or do you embed that software in a hardware product that carries then the solution in itself? And that's your business model. So I would argue that let's not talk about hardware, software anymore, but digital analog, and look at the business models that then are the best to optimize for the solutions that you have.
Can I just say on that, I couldn't agree more with Rene there. You can't, I get a lot of pushback being software focused because, people say software isn't going to solve climate change. And I agree. You absolutely need both software and hardware. It's not going to work otherwise. There's no silver bullet. There's no kind of one thing that's going to work. The reality is different funds have different mandates and different focuses. That's just the way of the world. Ours happens to be focused on software, but those software solutions do not work without the hardware, the underlying hardware.
Do you maybe see, out of curiosity, in the future that perhaps your fund might be looking into a different type of mandate, or this is just the way that you see for now going forward?
Quite possibly. Who knows? All I can do is kind of focus on trying to do what we do at the moment.
I also tend to agree with what has been said about software and hardware. What we've noticed from investing in some of these hardware plays is that, very seldomly is the point particularly about working on hardware. It's seen as a component to solve a bigger problem. And then, I think from an investor standpoint, the thing that people figure out is, are they willing to engage around hardware topics? Because it tends to have a implication on how long development times are, what your time to market is, how many iterations you can work on within, for example, the runway of a particular round and so forth. So it has big implications for the milestones that you set out to work on, but I think, no one...
The obvious one being how much funding they can require some of the bigger hardware.
How much do you need to raise? And I think we see, if I look at our software and software plus hardware portfolio, sort of as two different buckets, I think you tend to also start speaking to different types of investors fairly early on because of limitations that people have, and or on the upside, there's certain investors that are incredibly helpful when it comes to particular hardware-related challenges and that have been part of big upscaling journeys. And so, I think as a company, you want to figure out who is the right capital provider for you, and then go seek those type of partners as early as possible.
Perhaps you could name, because on your fund, I would say you go also more in the middle in that sense. You're looking, of course, in general on the sector instead of just hardware and software. Is there maybe some example of your portfolio companies that fall into specifically one of the other sectors, either on the software or hardware?
Well, I can take one example. We've invested in a company called 20 that is in the battery recycling space. And when you hear the word battery recycling, you might think there's actually not much software going into that, but similar to any other industrial process, at scale there will be digitally driven optimization of the whole manufacturing process, and the way they run, input and what happens in between that stuff coming out. So, there's big software elements to it, but of course you can't get comfortable with a topic like that unless you also feel comfortable with, the physical aspects and the fact that you have to build a plant and you have to raise capital for that and tap into, also hopefully more non-dilutive funding in the future that becomes available for the capex and the equipment part of things.
That's a good point. I think, Rene, you mentioned earlier that actually I think both of you and Adam as well, that energy infrastructure investments, they have been also a part of your, in the past year, some of the key focuses of what you've been doing from your fund. Could you share maybe some interesting examples or learnings that you have seen in the last few decades, specifically in this infrastructure base?
In the construction?
Energy infrastructure, like looking from the, especially on your business model side.
Well, on the infrastructure, that is energy infrastructure, the generation of power, you obviously see a big shift to renewables. That's a fact. About 25% of the production these days is done with renewables to create power. That's a great achievement that we have done in the last couple of years against maybe the costs that could justify those investments all the time. There's two things that now are at stake. One is we still have to do 75% of the energy infrastructure to change that over to renewables. So it's a big job still ahead of us. So let's not forget that we need, gear out there that generates power in a renewable way. But the good news is that due to the fact that the cost curves of many of these technologies have come down dramatically and still are coming down dramatically, it is not only from an environmental or climate aspect that renewables are needed, but they just make simply economic superior sense. And that fact itself will accelerate the transition in the years to come. So I'm very optimistic in that area that we will see that going faster and quicker. Albeit that on the infrastructure side, you see a race to the bottom. So from a venture capital perspective, to see assets to only become cheaper and the next generation is better than the previous one, that's quite a risk to invest in, I would say. So the business models that you attach to that asset development are going to be crucial. So optimistic that we will get there. Long way to go, but it makes only total sense from all aspects.
Maybe just to add, a trend that we see is, and find very interesting, is this whole decentralization of the energy system, right? Because with the build out of renewable capacity, you tend to have it spread out across countries and regions. With that decentralization, we think comes lots of opportunities to build a new tool stack for managing that type of energy system, right? So whether it's related to production, transmission, distribution, which has its own limitations, but nevertheless. And I think we'll also see some parts of the system being completely rethought. And so instead of trying to connect the renewables park, for example, to the main grid and distributing it the normal way, I think we'll see localized production also. And that's also what we're seeing within the portfolio in some of the later stage companies where people plug it directly into a solar farm or a wind farm and start producing stuff based on green electrolyzers and so forth. So this is way broader than just getting green electricity out of the power socket.
Maybe I can add to that with that decentralization of energy production, even to our homes, solar panels on your roof is a decentralized production solution. We see a lot of initiatives these days of companies that help investors and companies that try to help the end customer to understand what they need in order to ride that journey. Because the first 25% were the people that wanted to do it, were able to do it, were knowledgeable to do it, but the mass market that we have to address to the other 75% that I just mentioned, which includes all the decentralization, they still have to be educated at some point, and we need to help them to get over that fear of switching to a decentralized solution. So we see quite a few companies that help those customers with that journey, which is, I think, an interesting development to see. Whether it's on EV, whether it's on heat pumps, whether that is on insulation, or whether it's on the combination of all of those things, there's quite some interest there.
Yeah, I think it's worth bearing in mind though that the end customer journey can't be too radically different too quickly, because I think as VCs, a lot of the time what we look for is what we call disruptors, right? You're looking for disruptors, these things that are going to create big new category leaders. You have to remember that energy is a utility, right? The last thing that an end customer wants is their energy disrupted, right? Fundamentally, they need the lights on, they need the power going. So you just have to be cautious with them sometimes in how you approach that. But to Rene's point in terms of what I've seen over the past 10 years since investing in renewable energy, I think those cost curves were one of the big factors. So when I was doing it on the infrastructure side, they were heavily subsidized in the UK while those costs were coming down, the technology cost curves were coming down. And they are now at a point where it's economic to do it without subsidies, right? The subsidies worked exactly how they should. There's still other areas where those costs need to come down, batteries being an obvious one, because they're going to play a fundamental role in that decentralized journey. Decentralization comes with lots of opportunity. There's a lot of challenges involved as well that you see with things like negative pricing, grid constraints, because the grids were fundamentally not set up for that. They were set up to be, centralized power stations feeding out. When you try and plug stuff in all over the place, you start getting problems. So you start seeing more innovative models, things like microgrids, behind the meter co-locations. So you don't just put solar panels, say, on a factory anymore. You put a battery with them so that you can use or sell power at the right times. You've got EV charging infrastructure coming in now. That's going to play a big role. So yeah, lots going on.
Actually, since you touched the point on the EV infrastructure right now, it'd be interesting just to hear a little bit on of you. Like, there's been now a lot of companies coming into this space. Do you still feel that there is some innovation or technological innovations left that we should be looking in the EV infrastructure space, or do you feel that we have already quite a lot of companies tackling these current challenges? So in terms of investment point of view, what would be your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be innovation. There's always going to be interesting spaces. I think there are spaces within EV charging that have had a lot of focus and a lot of investment and a lot of startups, and you start to struggle to see kind of differentiation, and that becomes difficult. But there are aspects all around the EV charging scene where there's still going to be interesting opportunities. We actually signed a term sheet a couple of weeks ago with a company, not directly looking at EV charging per se, but the whole network around light electric vehicles, starting to connect various different stakeholders from that whole system together in a collaboration tool. So there's always opportunities, I think.
Well, looking forward to hearing more about that investment once it's going to be announced publicly. If we're just moving back a little bit when we discussed about the decentralized energy, and of course you, Adam, mentioned that the battery storage solutions and systems, that's a key part of that. And I know that, Rene, in your fund, you have recently also invested into Instagrid, in this portable energy systems. How do you see this, let's say, this trend or this space developing right now?
Yeah. Well, it's called Instagrid. It's a company in Germany that has developed or is focusing on portable battery storage. The core of their business is actually a battery management system. So again, the electronics, the digital side of a battery system. And they decided to package that solution into their own device. And they're selling now a portable battery solution, particularly for the construction industry. So what they're doing is straight out replacing diesel generators. You know, if you ever have done a remodeling of your house with some heavy duty work, then your diesel generator sits in your house for a couple of weeks to pollute the whole world. But now that's going to be done by with batteries. Then the construction workers can use that battery all day long and will be charged overnight. And that is going to expand into larger systems that also can power a whole construction site going forward. It is used at film sets, it's used at festivals. You see that replacements of diesel generators to become now the way forward. So that's a great development. we focus on this type of companies because they are not in the business of developing batteries, the battery cells or the packages. They just build systems around it and make that applicable as applications for the end users. And it's our belief that we don't even know what battery technologies are exciting and coming up. That's molecules. We don't focus on molecules. But we do know that there will be cheaper solutions there will be better solutions coming, and it's all about, can we build applications that make sense for end customers while saving CO2.
And I think it's a good example of, at least I tend to look at things through the framework of like, where do we have the use of fossil fuels that will need to be phased out over the coming years? And as it happens, construction industry is a big one, and someone packages finds the right business model and the right sort of components to plug into that, builds a viable case for that particular industry. And I would argue that if there's a new battery type popping up that is better suited for this, they can just swap out lithium ion or whatever else they're using. So I think it's like, it's a fascinating example actually. Yeah. And I think we'll see lots of those, like wherever we have fossil today, there will be someone looking at it. And then which of those are going to be venture plays and which are not going to be, I think that's probably our job to figure out and be part of supporting that.
Have you been tapping with Atlantic Labs? I think you've been also investing and looking into the battery space. Is there some, maybe let's say, exciting innovations that you have personally seen or from your portfolio that you have been looking into?
Yeah, totally. I mean, we've been broadly excited about batteries, and our view is that we're going to need lots of storage and a very important form of storage to cope with the intermittency of the new system is going to come in the form of batteries, electrochemical storage approaches, and just makes sense. Now, as it happens, we don't have a whole bunch of that in Europe or of the resources that goes into a battery. So I think for Europe in particular, a key theme is to be very resourceful with what we have, make the most out of it, both from a diagnostics and optimization standpoint, and I think that's also touching upon the BMS side of things, but also from a recycling standpoint. So these two have been our two first bets, and we continue to look at I would say things that are more in line with InstaGrid, right? Sort of very specific use cases where you combine software and batteries, that lends itself well to that particular customer group, and would want to do one or two more in this field.
I think also, Adam, you have been investing into company like GridCog in the energy grid space. Yeah. It's a little bit different, perhaps. You could see what was let's say the key innovations or what you really see in this space.
Well, I mean, that, again, batteries have a role to play in that. It's not the kind of molecules that we're looking at, but it's to what I was talking about earlier in terms of decentralized generation and the impacts of that around things like negative pricing and grid constraints. So what GridCog does is essentially modeling software for behind the meter sites where you don't just have solar panels anymore. You have solar panels with a battery, with potentially EV charging infrastructure. How those different types of assets interact with each other changes the kind of system that you need. When you're also pulling in things like offtake agreements and PPAs, different ownerships, the simulations start to get kind of more complex than Excel spreadsheets can handle. So that's around looking to more accurately model what the kind of system implications are.
Perfect. I think before we move into, want to touch base a little bit on the hydrogen industry, but just to wrap it up, we talk a lot about decentralized energy, and there has been big statements that we've been probably everyone reading in the media that decentralized energy is the future of energy. Is this something that, let's say, you from your fund's perspective or personal perspective fully agree, or do you still see that there is something else?
It's like the statement that there used to be mainframes and now there is iPhones. You bring the intelligence down to a decentralized level, and the same thing will be done with energy production, storage, and use. The challenge is that you need a network to balance that all, because in that respect, the energy network, the grid, is a very, very complex thing. It's more complex than the internet. People forget that, but if you look at a map of all the grids in Europe, how they are connected and how they are dependent of each other. It's just mind-boggling that the lights are on here. And if we are going to change that system by doing things locally and more out of balance, the chances that the lights go out are huge. And so we need companies like yours that you just mentioned. We have invested in a similar company called Tibo Energy. They also manage these local grids. That is where the intelligence comes in that is really required to make sure that the next 75% of this energy transition that we have to do is going to be one that we can live with and not being bogged down.
And I think it becomes increasingly hard as you go from 25 to close to 100%, right? The issues around intermittency and keeping the lights on and sort of consumers not feeling a difference is just exponentially more difficult.
Quite frankly, every time I see the lights go out somewhere, I find it's good news, because that makes us aware how vulnerable our energy system in the end is. And we need to transition, but it's a tough job. Yeah. We're just starting at just the beginning. We scrape the surface, and there's a lot of innovation already on the market. There's a lot of technology on the market. It's applying business models that make sense to make that work. And I think that's the opportunity we all have, and it's great to see. Also in this part of the world, there is good companies that are trying to work on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there can be any real debate around whether decentralization is going to be, it's already happening and has been happening. Is it going to be supplemented by other things like potentially nuclear or other solutions in the future? Yeah, probably, because there's, like I said, there's no one solution, right? There's going to be multiple solutions working together. But Rene's right, this is a really complicated space. Energy is a complicated space, and that just brings me back to kind of what we're looking for when we're looking to invest. And one of the big focuses is on the founders generally, but within energy in particular, I think deep domain expertise of energy, like that they really know these systems, they've been working in these systems, is one of the things I look for personally, because I think it's just so hard to. A lot of people are attracted to the space because they look at the energy markets and they're like, well, they're vast, value-wise, they're huge. We can do something in that, and people come in and we'll try and build stuff. It's just a very complicated space to just move into and get your head around all the different players, all the different intricacies of it. All the founders that I've kind of invested in have been in energy for 10, 15 years, and they're far, far more knowledgeable about it than I am.
Maybe the one thing I would add to this is that, I mean, with decentralization obviously comes tons of challenges, but with it comes also a higher degree of resilience, which I think is, given how the world is developing right now, I think is going to be important. And, you look at conflicts around the world and you see that energy infrastructure is increasingly becoming targets of enemies. And so having the ability to also protect these decentralized assets is something we've started thinking about. And I don't have a solution yet as to how to do that, but I think as the society also more broadly is electrified, we're going to have to look after these things.
Yeah. To this point as well, we all talk about climate tech basically as the overarching goal that we have to save the world by saving the climate. But I think that the reason that we're doing all of this is also shifting towards what I said before. It makes economic sense right now, so there's actually no question. You're not going to put a gas-fired engine anymore up somewhere. And secondly, it is about security of your energy supply. So if you are bringing it decentralized into your country or into Europe or even into your home, or company, then you have security, and I think those will be the drivers for this innovation going forward, and that is those are good reasons that people also can better understand than the climate, which is a little bit more of a fake, longer term issue that we are experiencing some reflections on, but it's not tangible enough. Economics and security, those things.
I think, to echo that, the economics, generally across climate tech, I think you have to have economics and mission intertwined, because without the economics, if they're not kind of showing P&L impact to your end customers, it's not going to scale as well. Emissions gone, and it's the same within energy. So we've invested in a company called TEM, which is fundamentally an energy marketplace, connects small businesses to renewable energy generators. Now, yes, they get access to renewable energy, and that's great, but the number one reason that customer uses it is it's cheaper. You get cheaper energy. The fact that it's renewable is great, but number one is economics.
I think thank you so much. We have come to the end of this energy transition panel discussions, but for all the startups out in the audiences, as you heard from our great speakers today, there is a lot of opportunities in the energy transition space. And regardless whether you come from software, hardware side, it's all about, in the end, like our panel said, it's about the business model as well as the economic side. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.